The day my homeowners association called my backyard clothesline a symbol of poverty, I honestly laughed because I thought it had to be some kind of joke. 3 months later, the president of that same HOA was standing in a courthouse answering questions from a criminal investigator. 4 board members had resigned, and the clothesline they wanted gone was still hanging exactly where it had always been. Looking back now, I realized none of it was ever about laundry. It was about power, ego, and what happens when the wrong person mistakes a quiet neighbor for an easy target. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for almost 6 years I lived in a peaceful subdivision just outside Cedar Ridge, a town where people waved from their driveways, kids still rode bicycles until sunset, and most arguments were about whose dog kept digging under the fence. My wife, Melissa, always joked that I was born 50 years too late because I liked fixing things instead of replacing them, growing tomatoes in raised beds, and hanging our laundry outside whenever the weather cooperated. Maybe she was right. There was something satisfying about pulling warm sheets off a line after they'd spent the afternoon in fresh air instead of tumbling inside an electric dryer. The clothes smelled cleaner, our power bill stayed lower, and honestly, it just felt like home. Our clothesline wasn't some ugly contraption sticking into the skyline either. I had installed 2 sturdy metal posts between a pair of old oak trees in the far corner of our backyard, hidden behind a 6-foot privacy fence that blocked the view from almost every direction. Unless you were standing in exactly the right spot inside 2 neighboring yards, you couldn't even tell it existed. For 5 years, nobody cared. Not one complaint, not one comment, not one awkward conversation over the fence. Then everything changed after the annual HOA election. That's when Vanessa Carlisle became board president. Vanessa had moved into the neighborhood less than a year earlier, but she acted like she'd personally built every house on the street. She drove a spotless white luxury SUV, wore expensive sunglasses even on cloudy mornings, and somehow managed to smile without looking friendly. Every board meeting suddenly became a lecture about elevating community standards. First, it was mailbox colors, then flower beds, then lawn edging. Every month there seemed to be another speech about protecting property values, as if a single blade of grass growing too long would collapse the local housing market overnight. Most people rolled their eyes and quietly complied because arguing with the HOA usually cost more time than it was worth. I figured she'd eventually run out of things to complain about. I was wrong. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home from work and found an official violation notice folded neatly inside my mailbox. I remember standing there in my driveway reading the first sentence 3 different times because it sounded so ridiculous that my brain refused to accept it. According to the new architectural standards approved by the board, outdoor clotheslines were now prohibited because they projected an image of economic hardship and negatively affected the appearance of the neighborhood. I had 15 days to remove mine or face a $300 monthly fine. I actually laughed out loud. Melissa walked outside, saw my face, took the paper from my hand, and after about 10 seconds she looked at me and said, "They're serious, aren't they?" I nodded. Apparently drying towels outside makes us look poor now. She shook her head and muttered, "Imagine having so little to worry about that someone else's laundry becomes your emergency." At first I thought maybe there had been a misunderstanding, so I walked around my yard just to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious. The clothesline was exactly where it had always been, tucked behind the fence, hidden beneath the branches of the oak trees. You couldn't see it from the street. You couldn't see it from the sidewalk. Honestly, you'd have to be trying pretty hard to find it. Still, the notice was real, and the deadline was already counting down. So I attended the next HOA meeting, expecting a reasonable conversation. Instead, I walked into what felt more like a corporate presentation than a neighborhood gathering. Vanessa stood at the front of the clubhouse holding a slideshow full of glossy photos from upscale communities in other counties. She talked about branding, perception, luxury living, and maintaining a premium image. When my turn came, I politely asked how something hidden behind my own privacy fence could possibly damage anyone else's property value. She smiled the kind of smile people use when they've already decided your opinion doesn't matter. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "this isn't about visibility. It's about the standard we choose to represent. Modern communities embrace modern conveniences." I couldn't help myself. "So electricity is mandatory now?" A few people chuckled, but Vanessa didn't. "Homeowners are expected to use appropriate appliances consistent with the character of this community." The room went quiet. I looked around expecting someone else to question how absurd this sounded, but most people stared at the table, avoiding eye contact. That's when I realized something important. They weren't agreeing with her. They were simply tired. Tired of arguing. Tired of letters. Tired of fines. I left that meeting with more questions than answers. 15 days later, the first $300 fine arrived. I paid it, not because I accepted that they were right, but because I wanted time. Time to think. Time to read. Time to understand exactly who was bluffing. And who actually knew the law. That decision turned out to be the best investment I ever made, because what I discovered over the following week didn't just save my clothesline. It started pulling apart a thread that would eventually unravel the entire HOA board. That decision turned out to be the best investment I ever made, because what I discovered over the following week didn't just save my clothesline. It started pulling apart a thread that would eventually unravel the entire HOA board. I spent every evening after work sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, legal websites on one screen, state statutes on the other, and a yellow legal pad slowly filling with notes. Melissa would bring me coffee around 9 every night, look at the pile of papers growing across the table, and joke that she hadn't seen me this obsessed since I rebuilt the engine in my old pickup. The funny thing was, I wasn't trying to become some legal expert. I simply wanted to know whether these people actually had the authority they claimed to have. Somewhere around midnight on the fourth night, I found exactly what I'd been looking for. Buried inside our state's property code was a right to dry act that had been passed years earlier. The language couldn't have been clearer. Homeowners associations could not prohibit residents from using solar drying equipment on private residential property. I read the paragraph again, then again. Then I pulled up the legislative history to make sure nothing had changed. It hadn't. There were no HOA exceptions, no luxury neighborhood exemptions, no loopholes about appearances. The law was exactly what it looked like. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time all week. Melissa walked in wearing one of my old college sweatshirts and asked, "Good news?" I turned the laptop toward her. "I think they just fined the wrong guy." The next morning, I printed the statute, highlighted the relevant sections, wrote a polite but firm letter requesting that the board immediately rescind the new rule, refund my fine, and confirm in writing that no further penalties would be issued. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. Honestly, I expected someone on the board to read the law, realize they'd made a mistake, and quietly fix it before things got expensive. Instead, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's attorney 8 days later. The tone was so confident it almost sounded rehearsed. According to their interpretation, planned communities retain broad authority to regulate aesthetics, even when state law protected certain homeowner rights. In other words, they believed they could simply redefine my legal protection as an appearance issue and pretend the statute no longer applied. My attorney laughed out loud when he finished reading it. His name was Daniel Harper, a calm man in his 60s who rarely raised his voice, which somehow made him even more intimidating. He slid the letter back across his desk and said, "Mr. Brooks, they're hoping you'll be scared by expensive words." Unfortunately for them, judges read the actual law. 2 weeks later, we filed for declaratory judgment in county court, asking the judge to invalidate the HOA rule and order reimbursement of every fine they had issued. Almost overnight, I became the neighborhood conversation. Some neighbors quietly stopped me while walking their dogs. A retired teacher named Linda whispered, "I hope you win. They're out of control." A young couple across the street admitted they'd already received violation notices because their trash cans had been visible for 20 minutes after pickup. An elderly widower told me he'd been threatened with daily fines because his mailbox flowers weren't colorful enough. Nobody wanted to testify, nobody wanted to fight, but everyone wanted somebody else to do it first. That realization bothered me more than the lawsuit itself. Fear had become normal around here, and people had slowly accepted that normal. Discovery began about 6 weeks later, and that's when this stopped being a simple disagreement over laundry. Daniel requested board emails, meeting minutes, internal communications, financial records related to policy changes, and documents discussing the adoption of the clothesline ban. The HOA attorney objected to almost everything, but the judge wasn't interested in games. "Turn it over," he ordered. "If it's relevant, the plaintiff is entitled to see it." About 3 days after the documents arrived, Daniel called me. I could hear something different in his voice before he even spoke. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need you to come to my office." I asked if something was wrong. He answered, "No, something is very right." Spread across the conference table were printed emails with highlighted passages. At first, they looked boring, mostly discussions about landscaping contracts and maintenance schedules. Then, one sentence caught my eye. Vanessa had written to another board member. If we increase enforcement numbers this quarter, we'll finally have enough justification to outsource community management. Another email mentioned that a professional management company would help maximize compliance revenue. Compliance revenue? I looked at Daniel. Isn't that just another way of saying fines? He nodded slowly. Keep reading. 20 minutes later, we found the piece that changed everything. Vanessa wasn't just recommending the management company. Her brother-in-law owned it. The company had already prepared a proposal months before the clothesline rule even existed. Internal emails showed discussions about generating enough documented violations to convince hesitant board members that outside management had become necessary. Every new rule wasn't about neighborhood appearance. Every violation wasn't about property values. They were manufacturing a problem so they could sell the solution to themselves. I remember sitting there staring at the stack of papers, feeling less angry than disappointed. I'd spent weeks assuming this was an ego problem, maybe someone enjoying authority a little too much. Instead, it looked like business. Cold, calculated business. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Conflict of interest, he said. Potential breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on what else we find, maybe more. The deeper discovery went, the uglier it became. Emails revealed Vanessa repeatedly encouraging inspectors to photograph minor issues from unusual angles, so they appeared worse than they actually were. Board members exchanged jokes about residents who always paid fines without asking questions. One message referred to homeowners as recurring revenue. I actually felt sick reading that one. These weren't neighbors anymore. They were customers trapped inside their own community. Meanwhile, the fines against me continued arriving every month. Daniel advised me to keep paying them temporarily because judges appreciate plaintiffs who follow procedure while challenging the legality of a rule. Every check I mailed felt like swallowing broken glass, but I trusted the process. Melissa noticed how quiet I'd become. One evening, she found me sitting alone in the backyard watching clean towels move gently in the breeze. She sat beside me and asked, "You okay?" I shrugged. "I keep thinking this started because somebody didn't like the way our laundry looked." She smiled softly. "No, it started because somebody thought nobody would ever push back." That sentence stayed with me all the way to trial. By the time our hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was nearly full. More neighbors showed up than I expected. Some came because they were curious. Others came because they had their own violation stories. Vanessa walked in wearing an expensive navy suit and carrying herself with the same polished confidence she displayed at every HOA meeting. She barely glanced at me. Her attorney argued first, insisting the board had broad discretion to maintain neighborhood standards and preserve property values. Daniel stood when it was our turn, walked directly to the judge, and placed the state statute on the podium. "Your Honor," he began calmly, "this case is actually much simpler than the defense would like you to believe. The legislature has already answered this question." For nearly 2 hours, both sides presented arguments, but I could tell something had changed when Daniel introduced the internal emails. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. The judge read several of them twice before looking over his glasses at Vanessa. "Mrs. Carlisle," he asked, "why was your relative's company discussing management contracts before these enforcement policies were adopted?" She hesitated for the first time since the hearing began. Her attorney objected, but the damage had already been done. The judge wasn't just evaluating whether my clothesline violated HOA rules anymore. He was beginning to wonder whether the rules themselves had been created for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with laundry and everything to do with money. The judge wasn't just evaluating whether my clothesline violated HOA rules anymore. He was beginning to wonder whether the rules themselves had been created for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with laundry and everything to do with money. You could almost feel the room change. Up until that point, the hearing had been exactly what everyone expected. Another boring dispute between a homeowner and an HOA. But after those emails were read into the record, nobody was thinking about towels hanging in my backyard anymore. They were thinking about why a board president had been talking about compliance revenue before the rules even existed. Vanessa's attorney tried to redirect the conversation back to aesthetics, insisting that any financial discussions were unrelated to the validity of the clothesline policy. But the judge wasn't buying it. He flipped through the exhibits one more time before looking directly at him. "Counselor, your client may argue aesthetics all day long, but these communications suggest the board had motivations beyond appearance. That concerns this court." Vanessa finally spoke. She claimed everything had been taken out of context. that her brother-in-law's company had simply submitted a proposal like many others, and that the timing was an unfortunate coincidence. Unfortunately for her, discovery had produced more than emails. Financial disclosures showed she had failed to report a personal financial relationship that HOA bylaws specifically required board members to disclose before voting on any matter involving a potential contractor. Daniel didn't have to raise his voice or deliver some dramatic speech. He simply placed the bylaws beside the disclosure forms and let the silence do the work. The judge read them carefully, removed his glasses, and quietly said, "I believe I've heard enough." 2 weeks later, the written decision arrived. I still remember opening the envelope at my kitchen table with Melissa standing beside me holding her breath. The court ruled that the clothesline restriction violated state law and was therefore unenforceable. Every fine issued under that policy had to be refunded with interest. The HOA was ordered to reimburse my attorney's fees in full, just over $18,000, because the board had knowingly defended an invalid rule after receiving notice of the governing statute. Melissa smiled, hugged me, and said, "Well, that's one expensive opinion about somebody else's laundry." We laughed, but the story wasn't over. Near the end of the judge's decision was a paragraph neither of us expected. Based on evidence uncovered during discovery, the court directed that portions of the record be forwarded to the county district attorney for review regarding possible violations involving conflicts of interest and misuse of fiduciary authority. I read that paragraph 3 times before it finally sank in. The civil case had ended, but another investigation was just beginning. News spread through the neighborhood faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. Within days, neighbors were knocking on my door, not to congratulate me, but to tell me their own stories. One family had paid thousands in landscaping fines they never questioned. A retired firefighter admitted he'd been cited repeatedly until he finally gave up and hired contractors he couldn't really afford. Another couple told me they had considered selling their home because they felt constantly harassed. Hearing all those stories made me realize my clothesline had simply been the loose thread. Once someone finally pulled it, the whole sweater came apart. About 3 months later, the district attorney announced formal charges against Vanessa related to official misconduct and fraud connected to undisclosed financial interests while serving on the HOA board. The criminal case ended with a plea agreement. She avoided prison, but only after admitting responsibility, completing community service, paying significant restitution, and accepting a permanent prohibition against serving on the board of any homeowners association within the state. 4 other board members resigned before the next election, explaining they had relied on Vanessa's advice and should have asked far more questions than they did. Whether they truly didn't know or simply chose not to know is something I'll probably never figure out. The neighborhood changed after that. The new board immediately repealed dozens of questionable enforcement policies, hired an independent ethics consultant to review governance procedures, and began publishing detailed financial reports that every homeowner could access online. Meetings that once lasted 3 tense hours suddenly became calm. Discussions about sidewalks, playground equipment, and snow removal, the kinds of things an HOA should probably spend its time worrying about in the first place. As for my backyard, the clothesline never moved an inch. The funny part is that once people realized it was perfectly legal, several neighbors installed their own. Linda, the retired teacher, put one up the following spring. The young couple across the street added theirs a month later. Before long, if you looked over enough backyard fences on a sunny Saturday afternoon, you'd see towels, blue jeans, and children's blankets moving gently in the breeze all across the neighborhood. Nobody complained. Property values didn't collapse. The sky didn't fall. Life simply went on. Every now and then, someone driving past my house notices the clothesline and asks whether it's really the one that started all the trouble. I usually smile and tell them, no, the trouble was already there. The clothesline just happened to expose it. That's probably the biggest lesson I took away from all of this. People who abuse small amounts of power usually count on everyone believing the fight isn't worth having. They hope you'll pay the fine, stay quiet, and move on because challenging them feels exhausting. Most of the time, they're right. This time they weren't. I never set out to become the guy who sued his HOA. I just wanted to dry my laundry outside. But sometimes standing up for one simple principle uncovers something much bigger than you ever imagined. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have taken the clothesline down and avoided the fight? Or would you have challenged the HOA knowing it could take months, cost money, and create enemies in your own neighborhood? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. and I'd really like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes common sense should matter just as much as community rules. You never know. The smallest dispute on the block might be hiding the biggest secret.